Hello, everyone. Today on our Cape Ann ARTWaves session, we have a very special guest, Clark Linehan, photographer. And before I introduce Clark, I just want to say that Cape Ann ARTWaves is a member show. It's hosted by me and Christine Fisher, and we host on alternate weeks. We have interviewed to date over 24 artists this year. And at the end of this interview today, you'll find all the different ways that you can see this. So thank you to 1623 Studios, and also thank you to C Arts, who has been promoting and sharing our interviews on a regular basis. I am very excited today to welcome Clark Linehan, who is the man behind the camera many, many times here on Cape Ann. I have populated my background today with an event that everybody knows and loves here in Cape Ann called Celebrate Wearable Art, because among the many contributions that Clark has made to Cape Ann, and we won't start here, but I do have to say that he did all of our work. I don't think we would be able to have had this runway show without his incredible work, which he did for us pro bono for C Arts. And so I want to publicly thank him today, first of all, for all the great work he did for Celebrate Wearable Art. That's sort of something I really felt we needed to do as a community. So thank you, Clark, and welcome.
Oh, thank you.
So Clark has a fantastic bio on his website. And so I really encourage everybody to read the entire thing and have a good chuckle. Because quite frankly, I know he's a very humble guy. But he has a fantastic background here in Cape Ann that started way back in 1984 when he actually lived here and had a studio here. And Clark, I'd love to start today by having you discuss, first of all, your own photography journey, just sort of in brief, because I think you held a camera very early in life. And then after that, we'll talk a little bit about your specific connection to Cape Ann.
Yeah, I probably got one of the more bizarre photographic backgrounds for a photographer that you'll ever run into. I did start very early on. My father always had cameras around, and I kind of took over one of his. And as I say on the website, it was an old Argus C3, which literally looked like a brick with a lens attached to it. You hand cocked the shutter with a spring, and it made this really weird pinging noise when you shot it off. So yeah, that was my first exposure to a camera, which was around the age of 5 or 6. And then after that, it just kind of slowly grew from there. I got much more heavily involved with it. I was doing a lot of photography all through high school on various ski trips and things of that nature, but it really kind of took off when I was in college, when I got started doing a lot of work for the PR department. I went to Curry College in Milton, and Curry at the time didn't have a fine arts department for photography. They did have one, but not specifically for photography. So part of my rather interesting photographic background is that a lot of my early lighting courses were taught by physics professors. So my background in lighting is very different than what probably most photographers would run into in your typical photographic school. So,
and I know that
I just kind of took off from there.
Well, no, I think the theme of lighting, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, will continue to come up in our discussion today. So certainly don't stop there, because I think you took all kinds of classes, and you were able to really jump into this pretty early on. I mean, you had a few other career moves, if I understand, early on.
Yeah, well, I was what I jokingly refer to as having been held hostage in a family-owned mechanical engineering firm. And I think the original plan was that I would eventually take that over. And as we can all tell, I managed to avoid plan A and went to plan B. And but I was doing that. That became an early source of a lot of photography that I was doing, not only for our company, but I started doing work for architects and contractors through that, shooting job sites. And some of my early architectural photography was through people that I met back then. And that was all, obviously all shot on film. This is all very pre-digital.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did the whole film thing, and I'm equipped for shooting film originally and still use I've still got lighting equipment that I've literally had for 35 years. In fact, I used a flash at a photo shoot yesterday that is probably 25, 30 years old.
Isn't that amazing?
So,
That's
yeah.
great. And it's
So,
interesting too, I think in your background, you speak specifically about how quickly you jumped into digital photography. I mean, you were way ahead of the curve there.
I was a very early adopter of digital, because at the time I was doing a lot of catalog photography, and being able to do digital greatly reduced the price for a lot of I do a lot of work for smaller clients like jewelry designers and things of that nature, and doing digital cut out the cost of the film, the processing, and the other big cost back then, which was Polaroid.
Mhm.
You were doing all kinds of testing pre-shoot with Polaroid, and Polaroid was a very considerable expense on any major shoot. So yeah, that became a big thing, and it was kind of actually funny because at the time I was shooting a lot of 4x5 and 8x10 inch film. So this is not like the little 35 millimeter, piece of film you think of, which is an inch by an inch and 3/8 or something like that. This was film that was literally 4 inches, 4x5 inches in dimension, and the other one was 8x10 inches in dimension.
Mm,
So I still have the huge studio stand that
mm.
I always joke, if my roof ever caves in, look for the studio stand because I'll be under it. But that was designed to handle a very heavy 8x10 view camera.
Yeah.
And that was then used for this itty bitty tiny, Nikon digital camera that became the first digital camera that I shot. I still have pictures of that from that camera on my website. Actually, there's a shot of some silicone plastic products, and that is actually still on my website.
Wow, that's fantastic. And I really applaud you because I know you've also, jumped right in terms of the work afterward in Photoshop. And I've seen it firsthand. And I know that, you really make sure that you kind of complete the cycle with the people that you work with. And that really adds a lot of value.
Well, originally what I intended to do was know enough Photoshop to be able to intelligently speak to the person whom I figured would be doing it for me.
Hmm.
Because when Photoshop really first started up, to effectively do it, you needed a computer with a fair amount of horsepower,
Mm,
which back then I didn't have. But I had made connections at Adobe. I was a beta tester for 5 versions of Photoshop in the end.
mm,
And I got to the point where I came to the realization that I couldn't really trust people necessarily to do Photoshop for me, because they would talk like they knew what they were doing. And I would realize very quickly that they didn't know what they were doing.
mm.
So I became a beta tester for Photoshop. And then on top of that, that led to a connection with Kodak at one point when Kodak got in heavily into digital.
Mm.
And I became involved with their photo CD project, where Kodak got into scanning images and providing, different high res versions of scanned film,
Wow.
a product that they have since abandoned. But
Mm.
yeah, it got me into a lot of interesting connections in the early digital photography world that
Well,
uh,
and actually, I think that today's photographers who just sort of jump into the digital world have you to thank probably for a lot of bugs and other things that got worked out early on, right?
well, I used to tell people, I would get all these messages from people saying, what do I buy? What do I buy? And it was a perfect example of analysis paralysis.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
I would say, just buy what feels good in your hands, because it's better than, some of these
Mm,
crazy amateurs that think that, it's got to be absolutely perfect. And when you figure that, either for publication or for nothing more than web publication, you really don't need, crazy, insane quality. It's,
yeah.
back in the day when you still had Architectural Digest and you had a few
Mhm.
really high quality publication magazines, you just don't need to meet that kind of a standard anymore, unless you are shooting for art.
Okay,
If
and
you're shooting for art, that's a different story.
agreed, agreed. I want to interrupt you for a minute because Speaking of shooting, I know you have a camera set up there in the background, and we've talked about the fact that the first, well, I love this in your bio, that the first camera you used, you thought could be an anchor for a boat.
Right,
So we've
right.
come a long way in terms of power for camera and power in our crazy iPhones for taking pictures. But I'm sure this is the most common question you're asked. Tell us the camera of choice beside the one that's with you that day, which I know was your standard answer.
Well, I mean, that first digital camera that you can still see the photograph on my website, that camera was 3.3 megapixels.
Wow.
It was an early Nikon.
Hmm.
The camera I'm currently using is a Canon D5S, which is 50 megapixels.
Hmm.
So much greater resolution. Far overkill for certainly for web. And that's why you can use an iPhone or something like that if all you're really doing is going for social media or website use. But a lot of what I still do ends up as trade show panels and large prints for in clients' offices. And so I still need pretty much as big a film as I can get. There was one project that for a trade show panel that required I still actually have a 4x5 view camera that's in storage that I then attached a 300 megapixel digital back to photograph some pieces for a client that were then turned into trade show panels that were 12 feet in one dimension.
Wow.
So, and literally you could walk up to it and read stuff on it. So,
You're real, Clark, you're such a technician. And, I think anybody that just wants to have a discussion about the power of the instrument itself would find you could probably go in depth, go toe to toe with anyone in this field. I mean, I know you also worked in a camera shop, so you've got the whole picture. But I'm going to move on because we have so much to cover today in terms of your connection to Cape Ann, which is one of the things that I really wanted to establish, because you don't physically live here now, but to me, you're still a presence here. I know my own experience. I've had you, as I said, up for various Sea Arts fundraisers, to take pictures over at Bass Rocks Golf Clubs of the artists with their work, for Celebrate Wearable Art. You've helped at the Cape Ann Artisans. I mean, you've really been in, I know you still work with Beth and a lot of the individual artists, but that's such a small part, of your total portfolio. But you still have all these Cape Ann connections from your 25 years here. So let's talk about that. What are some of the things that really got you going when you came to Cape Ann, and you had some actually pioneering roles here on Cape Ann in photography?
well, I had a studio at Blackburn Center, two studios there for 25 years. And I lived in East Gloucester, literally right across the street from what used to be the East Gloucester Fire Station. So that was where I lived. I used to ride my bike from my house up to the studio, and used to ride around the back shore in order to stretch the ride out a little bit. So yes, I definitely lived there. I worked at a camera store in Gloucester for a couple of years. And originally the whole group that I shared the original studio with were all other photographers and people who, some of whom are still on Cape Ann.
Mm.
So yeah, but I would get pulled into various other involvements. I became one of the original group of photographers invited to join the Rockport Artists Association when they started up their photography division, and eventually I became a member of the board there because of it. And that led to my getting involved with the first sculpture show that was held there, that I did in conjunction with Daniel Altschuler, who's a fairly well-known sculptor on Cape Ann. And then following that, I ended up getting involved with the sculpture show that they had in conjunction with the Gloucester 375th anniversary, where I was originally involved in just photographing and creating a catalog for that show. But then after it had been running for a month, I was asked to take over the actual management and running of it for 5 months.
Wow.
So that was
Was that in City Hall? Was that the
yeah,
one?
that was the one at City Hall.
Yep.
I
Talk
don't
about
think
lighting, right, Clark?
I don't think some of the counselors were all that enthralled that it went on for 6 months, but
Okay.
yeah, very considerable exposition, and so I ended up running that for 5 months, and as I said, did the catalog for it and all the rest of that, all the photography. It was absolutely insane. I had to get an insurance rider for the studio because I think at one point I had $3 million worth of sculpture at the studio.
Wow.
So it was quite an experience. Well, I guess that's part of this. I've gotten involved with a number of unusual projects
I'm sure you
through various connections that I've made through Cape Ann and through family and
Mhm.
things of that nature. So
And I believe you did work for the Cape Ann Museum as well.
I do. I've done a lot of photography for the Cape Ann Museum, both basically copy of their artwork, but I've also shot a lot of sculpture for them.
Mhm.
I also had the interesting experience of shooting for Walker Hancock while he was still alive and learning a lot from him, and then shooting some of his pieces years later for the museum. So it was, I've been exposed to especially through the sculpture, I've been exposed to some very interesting people and pieces.
Yeah.
So it's given me really an education in sculpture that I would never have expected to have had.
That's just fantastic. It's interesting because you really do cross over a lot of genres of photography. And I don't think people in this generation in Cape Ann, people like me, never really had the opportunity to see, the full range of your work, which is why I really wanted to bring it out in this discussion. But let's go back to your sort of interest because you still have sort of your own point of view on the way that you photograph. So, did you have any other outside influences for the photography that you do today, regardless of genre?
Well, I had a couple of people that I was fortunate to go to a couple of lectures given by Ansel Adams.
Mm.
And this was well before I had any interest in or knowledge that I would end up doing photography full time. So I had that fortunate experience. I had a couple of other people whose books I read and whose seminars I went to that whose names aren't coming to mind right at the moment, but uh,
Well, I know
I,
you've mentioned a few to me, people that do some work for National Geographic and also,
oh, that would have been Galen Ruel, who
okay.
was an absolutely outstanding adventure and wildlife and landscape photographer who unfortunately died before his time in an airplane crash on the way to photograph something. But yeah, he's a whole series of books that you can find with him. He was really pre-digital, I think, in that he was a guy that, back in the days of Kodachrome, he was a user of that and just did absolutely fantastic work. But yeah, he was one, and then uh, remind me of the other that I was.
You mentioned Dean Collins and Scott Kelby. Neither.
Yeah, Scott Kelby is still around and is still active. He's heavily involved with Adobe. So he does, in addition to Photoshop, there's a second editing program now called Lightroom, which is also an Adobe product. So he goes around the country doing demonstrations and lectures on using that. So generally speaking, if I have the time to do it, I'll go to that. The other one, Dean Collins, was again a lighting specialist, and I think that as I mentioned, I view lighting as being 99% of the job. Anybody can go out and buy a high resolution camera, but if you don't know how to light a product properly or a subject properly, all you end up with are these really huge files of garbage. So everybody can load up a hard drive, but are they usable pictures? In a lot of cases, no, they're not. And this is what I run into with a lot of the industrial stuff I do with a lot of the jewelry photography
I know.
that I do and it's probably no tougher product to photograph than jewelry, really. It's certainly right up there. And again, lighting is critical.
So I'm going to move on because I don't want to be run out of time. And I do think that this really goes into the next question, which is really how you have distinguished yourself and built a following over the years. I know personally from experience, you are really the easiest person to work with that I've ever worked with on anything. Things just seem to roll off of you, Clark. You've come up against, but I think go back to the lightings, I think the actual work itself. And then there's also the way that you have, obviously your work speaks for itself. But I think it's also the way you've built your business, which is important.
Well, a lot of the business that I've built is because people that I've done work for through the years drag me along as they go from company to company. And, hopefully I can hold on to the company they just came from. But yeah, that's one of the things that I find something like LinkedIn to be very useful for, is it lets me know if somebody that I've been working with has gone from company A to company B to C to D to E sometimes. But yeah, a big part of what my success has been is that the people that I do work with tend to be a lot of long-term relationships.
Yeah.
And a lot of times they introduce me, to other people, through both referral, but some of the real funky, fun stuff that I've gotten to do. I met Heidi Dallin back when Blackburn Theater, and North Shore Music Theater and all the rest of that. So I got, when she became the PR director at North Shore Music Theater, I got to do all the photography there for her for 2 or 3 years. So that was a very interesting experience. It's just so many oddball things that through friends, I've gotten involved with.
But I do think that we can say, and I've seen it over and over again working with artists, that everybody thinks they can just photograph their own work.
So the whole idea of people doing work on their own and things of that brings up my 3 least favorite words in the English dictionary, which are, it's good enough. If that's your attitude towards presenting your work in the best way, I probably really don't necessarily want to work with you. Because if you don't understand the difference between presenting whatever it is in the best possible light, then you'll never understand the value that somebody like me, I would like to think, brings to a photo shoot.
We can work through that. Let's move quickly on to the last couple of questions I have for you. One is just mention 1 or 2 of your favorite shoots and why. I know you mentioned something about the zoo was one, and whatever else you'd like to mention, because
well, my younger brother is the CEO of Zoo New England, so he's one of my favorite pro bonos, obviously. So that's led to shooting a lot of the baby animals. It's led to shooting all of his events. Like, he does a beer tasting event every year normally. They do a food truck event every year normally. So that's certainly a fun and what I call a therapy client. When I've been shooting catalog stuff of I have one client who stocks 600 different kinds of casters. The little wheels that go on the bottom of a desk chair. Well, they make those big enough to actually roll around a jet engine.
Wow.
So I have one client for whom I photograph those, and I can spend 4 or 5 days at a time shooting just those.
Wow.
And so I need something that doesn't cause brain damage to compensate for that. The other fun one I had was I was doing photography for the Boston Breakers, the women's pro soccer team in Boston when they were still around. So that was fun. I still actually play soccer. When I lived in Gloucester, I ran back then the over 30 and then over 40 soccer team that was in Gloucester. So that's
just fantastic, Clark. I love the depth and breadth of your experience. We're going to move on because you have so much knowledge about what makes or breaks somebody that needs to have something photographed, whether it's industrial or artistic. So I want to just dig in for this last little piece of advice from you to your clients and just the world out there What is the best way to ensure that you tell your story properly through photography?
Well, I think that what you want to do is you want to know what your message is. I think it's like kind of like marketing 101. What are you selling? Is it, your product or your service or whatever it is, you need to know what you need to do to present it properly, whatever it is.
Hmm.
And if that involves photography, then, I go to photo shoots any number of times and just did recently where the client told me to be there at 7 o'clock. And at 10 o'clock, he came back out and said, well, go find something else to do because we're not ready. So I have clients that, either waste a lot of time or that, again, aren't presenting themselves as best they possibly could because they haven't really gone and, if they had 4 or 5 widgets to photograph, nobody really looked to see if those were the 4 or 5 best examples
Right.
of what they had in stock. So again, it comes down to preparation and knowing what it is you're trying to do ultimately with my time and your time. I don't want to waste either of our time is
Right.
really what it comes down to. And
So
I certainly want to produce the best work I can.
yeah, exactly. So I think, as you said, be prepared, put your best product forward. I mean, that's kind of what I heard from what you just said.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So let's go to sort of finish up. Now, of course, big challenges across the board, for every small business, just like yours. And I know you've had a lot of your own challenges this year. So as you look forward to getting through the next, 6 to 12 months of COVID, uh, what are you thinking about? What are you hoping for?
Well, when I'm thinking about and looking for are clients who will literally let me in the door to do photography there. I've had a couple of photo shoots just recently canceled or postponed because clients are so concerned about keeping their employees healthy that they don't want to bring in outside people. I'm actually having a COVID test done in order to meet the requirement for a client
Hmm.
next week.
Yeah.
Uh, but beyond that, I'm basically asking clients that have equipment or product that can be shipped to me. I still have a studio set up to shoot in, so I can deal with things that way too. But as much as anything, probably 75% of what I shoot now is on location,
Hmm.
and it's just a matter of being able to get back in the door.
Right. Well, listen, I am just so impressed, Clark, with everything you've done. It has been so much fun to speak with you today. And I learned something new myself. As many times as I've worked with you, I've never heard all these stories. And so I know that everybody in Cape Ann will totally appreciate it. And I hope
Well,
to seek you out because I know you'll drive anywhere. In fact, you and I did a shoot in Maryland once together, right? An industrial shoot. So
I used to have a client in South Carolina that I used to drive
there
to
you
all the
go.
time. Yeah.
So there's no barriers for working with Clark. You're flexible and you're fun, and you've done so much here in Cape Ann and so much pro bono work. I don't encourage more of that. I encourage people to really look at your full professional portfolio. And this is the end of this interview, and I would like to encourage our audience to find us on 1623 Studios, also on YouTube, and look for this interview on Facebook and also on Twitter, and it will be on Channel 12 on local Studio 1623 cable television. So until next time, saying goodbye for Cape Ann ArtWaves, and thank you, Clark Linehan.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity.